Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to you all to this webinar, How Business Can Lead and Compete in an Age of Disruption. My name is Alice Spencer. I'm the Executive Director of Education at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And it's going to be a pleasure for me to host the conversation this afternoon before welcoming you to ask some questions later on. So just briefly, on the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, your first acronym and hopefully the last of the day, CISL. We are an impact-led institute within the University of Cambridge, working globally with leaders and innovators across business, finance and government to drive real and transformative action for a sustainable future. So we've been doing this for over 35 years now, creating these safe spaces to challenge and to support those with the power to act. And we continue with that legacy today with our audience. We are welcoming you as senior decision makers, strategists, and sustainability leaders navigating complexity and disruption. So today I am joined by our CEO at CISL, Lindsay Hooper, alongside Paul Gilding, a fellow at CISL and renowned author, activist, and generally a global authority on the topic of disruption. Together, Lindsay and Paul are the co-authors of our narrative shifting reports. Firstly, Survival of the Fittest, from ESG to competitive sustainability, and the subject of our conversation today, Competing in the Age of Disruption. So before I welcome Lindsay along to set the scene, I'll just share briefly the three things that we're hoping to dive into today. Firstly, looking in a bit more detail about the industrial and economic transition already underway in shaping how we produce, consume, and create value. We'll then explore the strategic risks of inaction and the new opportunities for business to drive resilience, innovation, and long-term value. And then finally, we'll talk you through via Q&A the 6 leadership priorities for those ready to shape the future and compete to win in the markets and industries that are going to shape that future. So we have 20 minutes or so for audience Q&A at the end of our conversation. Please do note down questions, reflections, challenges as we go, and we will come to you towards the end. So to help set the scene, a question for Lindsay, and it's a straightforward one. Why did we publish these reports?
Thanks, Alice. The first report that we published was intended as a provocation, and the short answer is we saw a constellation of trends and indicators that were really leading to a conclusion that current corporate approaches were not effective, but we were concerned that the quality of debate was really not where we thought it really needed to be, ought to be, and it was intended as a provocation. To unpack that a little, we were seeing some really hard and challenging data that we are not, decades of talk, we're not keeping pace with the scale of the challenge. What we're doing at the moment isn't working. So just defending it is frankly not going to be good enough. A number of the clients we were working with who could see the need to transition, could see the need to bet on the future rather than defend the past, were facing real market barriers. So consumer market barriers, capital market barriers. We were seeing the end of what I call the ESG hype bubble, political backlash, challenging action as being woke or naive or dangerous or anti-growth. But at the same time, we're seeing growing disruption from new entrants, and I suppose the European electric vehicle market and how they've been affected by innovation, new entrants from China is the iconic example there. So we felt that the debate at the time, which was kind of double down and defend corporate ESG approaches, or kind of give up altogether, was not the quality of conversation that was needed. So we published as a provocation, which is saying, let's get real and honest and recognize businesses will do what they're rewarded to do. And while it remains, as we've got on this slide, more profitable for businesses to trash the planet than protect it, that's exactly what they'll do. So there's an imperative in businesses' own interest to drive a redesign of markets, to give them the incentives, to design out the competitive disadvantage that first movers sit with, to give them a viable pathway to transition. and recognizing that if everyone's stuck in doing only the win-wins within current markets, if all we get is the cumulative impact of what can be afforded in the current market context, we will collectively fail. So the challenge shouldn't be how much can we afford within current markets, but how do we accelerate and benefit from rapidly driving market-wide change. So that was the first publication intended as a provocation. And we recognize, if we move to the next slide, the imperative for action from business is really twofold. There are risks on two fronts, that systemic instability of transition, if we collectively don't move fast enough, and we'll have cascading crises. But on the other hand, there are big players and big money betting on the future, and there's a risk of being displaced if the transition moves faster than any entity moves. But the reality for many businesses, and I'm talking particularly about those that need to transition, are they have to keep delivering in the short term while also building that viable bridge to the future. And a lot of what I've seen and heard over recent months in the face of backlash and pressure has been, well, maybe we'll sit this one out, we'll wait for it to emerge. And my concern, our concern is that pathway is not going to build itself. It will be built by those that step up, innovate, help create it. And it's, I think, dangerous or naive to say, well, we're just going to wait till market conditions improve. So our second report was very much a response to a lot of the feedback we got, which is kind of, okay, we get the arguments in principle and recognize this isn't only us. Many in the sustainable business space, I think, are recognizing we need effective, not just more regulation, effective regulation. We're going to need state action, but how realistically are we going to get that in practice? So the follow-up report was very much a response to that, framed around this sense that we are already seeing a green or a clean industrial revolution. It's underway. It's not happening fast enough. This is one where we can't just leave it to markets and tech. We've got to move faster and accelerate within planetary boundaries, and we have to do it in a way that builds rather than erodes social stability. That's not going to be achieved through box ticking and compliance and reputation management. So the second report is very much a how, but with a really clear framing that the scale of what it is that the private sector needs to be accelerating in their own interests. I think the final slide that Nate is going to share before we get into the detail is really just sets the scene for this conversation. It just has the key dimensions of business action that we've highlighted. Recognizing that all of the standard business playbooks of do your assessment, set your targets, embed, collaborate, it's not that isn't relevant, but a much greater onus on driving market-wide change than just relying on institutional action, goal setting, embedding, being incrementally less bad. But back to you, Alice.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. That's really helpful setup. I'm sure everyone has diligently read the report before joining this conversation. However, it's really great to get your words. And I know we test our thinking on these reports very regularly and are constantly adapting to the feedback we've received. So super helpful update. Right, so it's exactly this strategic response slide that I'm going to invite us to dig into in a bit more detail. So those 6 leadership priorities that we have posed there, we have got 20 minutes to have a conversation and to delve into this. And I say this with utmost respect and love. After a decade of working with Paul and Lindsay, I know you're not exactly under-opinionated, so please do forgive me if I wrangle us a little bit to keep as best as we can to time to allow for the audience Q&A. So firstly, and perhaps most importantly, fundamentally with the mindset shift point there, and the argument for the importance of that mindset shift. We hear a lot about organizations needing a compelling business case, embedding sustainability into their core strategy, purpose, etc. So is a mindset shift really needed in addition to that?
Paul.
Yeah, let me jump in on that, because I think absolutely it is, because what business and sustainability people have learned to do is take up the language of business value. This is worthwhile, this creates value in the following ways, etc., but not really in the behavior. So what the result has been is that we hear the words, we don't see the action, and almost every business, I would argue, and I'm talking about leadership companies in sustainability, are doing things on the side of their business rather than core to their business. And it's kind of like the business community's picked up the language of the sustainability world and talks about win-wins and talks about working together and talks about the fact that this affects the whole economy, so we're all at risk and we must all work together. That is not the reality of how business works. My business is not a cooperative, hold hands, sing kumbaya, go off in the sunset sort of culture. It's a competitive culture. And if we don't engage that competitive urges and reality and performance that these companies are judged by, we won't get serious action. So as a result, what we see is people working together, which on the surface is very hard to resist, and seems like a good thing to do. But in reality, what that means is those businesses are not pursuing value at the expense of their competitors. And that mindset shift, I think, is just really profound and super important, because at its core, sustainability is a economic transformation, right? We are not going to achieve anything like the scale of change we need to make unless we see a competitive disruption happening inside the market. And that's not the mindset we have today. The mindset we have today is cooperative, friendly, working together, win-win sort of culture. The reality is that what we see today, and we'll come back to, is that business is threatened by sustainability, is threatened by climate change, and certain industries and companies will have to cease to exist as we move forward, right? So if the fossil fuel industry, for example, wins, and in their current strategy of expanding production, other industries will lose, right? So it's not like there's no way to get through this unless we recognise that disruption is the name of the game, and that a bunch of companies are going to literally lose their existence in some cases, but certainly lose market share and be replaced by other companies. And that's not the mindset we have in business today around sustainability.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So I think we're going to, so I was just going to say, Lindsay, going a bit past beyond doing our bit. So please do elaborate on what Paul said, Lindsay. Thank you.
No, absolutely. So I've spent in the last 6 months quite a lot of time with executive teams and boards, and much of that has been often because they've had what I don't know, perhaps this is stereotyping or simplifying too much, but had set their targets in a way. In some cases, kind of because everybody set targets, and it's a dumb thing to do to set your targets and then look at how you can implement, and almost then retrofitted the business case for why it made sense to have those targets. So talking the language, as Paul said, of having a value-based approach, but it had started with a values or doing the right thing or pleasing stakeholders or doing what market sentiment was suggesting, and then making a retrofit business rationale for why that made sense. And then when the tide has gone out or stakeholder or market expectations have shifted, there haven't then been the fundamentals to scaffold a strategy going forward when there are questions being asked about, well, what happens after these targets, or what if we can't deliver? So I've often seen a kind of a vacuum there or a real uncertainty, like the rug's been pulled out, but we don't have a strategic framework or imperative to know now how to respond if plan A didn't work. And so that leaning on some of that external scaffolding infrastructure, I see a lot of underestimating of the impact, kind of the time frame of how soon those will be. There's still this sense this is long term, this is, it'll affect others, not us. So I think still an underestimating, or a kind of dissonance, people saying, this is all terrible, but then not assessing their strategy against that reality, almost seeing these kind of as these are two separate worlds. But even after very significant conversations about strategic implications, I still hear this default, which I think comes from, where sustainability sat for 30 years, this sense of, well, of course we'd like to do our bit, or of course we'd like to act in line with our values. So there's still that kind of situating action on this as just as a values-based or just as a doing our bit-based thing. So I think there's some of that dissonance that exists. So it's not just, as Paul said, it's the language, and it's not just the behaviour. There's the attitude, the whole way that people see this, I think in some cases hasn't yet shifted.
Okay, so I think if sustainability is the language that business has been learning. ESG would represent the phrase book that has guided them a lot of the time. And just onto the second point around escaping the ESG trap, as it's been phrased in the report. That's arguably for some quite controversial to ask people to abandon that sort of terminology language, because there is some long-held beliefs that ESG has been a really important stepping stone, that we now have better data, transparency, that voluntary action does actually provide the groundwork for regulatory action. So what exactly are you arguing that business should do in escaping the ESG trap? I'll come to you, Paul, first of all.
Yeah, I think the essence of the problem is in the language, that as well as making money, you should do the right thing for the environment, socially, governance, etc. So it's a tack on extra to do separate to the business. And you should report against that. You should, give us your performance, set targets in these areas while you're making money in the business. And that set up, and it's not that it was necessarily wrong for the time. The point is that it's not working today. Right. And I think it's the crucial mindset shift we need to make on this topic, is that to recognize that all the ideas we had about corporate sustainability, which was basically, to oversimplify, companies would lead, right, show the way forward, to create value in doing that, other companies would follow, right? And that has not happened. So we're not seeing material impact in terms of sustainability from the corporate sustainability world. And we're also not seeing significant business value at a material level being created in that process. Not that there's none. There's always some you can find in reputation, in attraction of staff, etc., but it's not material to the business. So Lindsay's point that we'd like to do more, but, we'd like to do these things, and the but is we have to make money. So that immediately says that the stuff that we're talking about is not about making money. And there's a good argument that says the businesses, need to be regulated, need policy, which we'll come back to. But if you want to engage the corporate sector, you have to engage it on its own terms. And its own terms is that it's being held to account for the creation of value. So if you're then doing things because you recognize that value is at risk, then there's no either or. You are then investing in solving a problem, which is a business problem, to either capture new value and opportunity or prevent the loss of value through risk. And that's the big change, I think, versus an ESG mindset, which is always a sort of tack on. So there wouldn't be a backlash against ESG if it made money, right? This is not just about politics. Yes, there is lots of politics going on, obviously, on this issue, ideology and so on. But fundamentally, business wouldn't be running and hiding as they are now if what they were doing was fundamentally about business strategy. Right, so that change in the political environment tells us everything we need to know, that if the politics change, if the sentiment changes, we can stop doing sustainability. That immediately answers the question, okay, this is not about business value then. And that's a big shift, I think.
Yeah, and moving past strategy and business value to what ESG means in practical terms within many companies that we engage with, at least in terms of the reporting and disclosures. Lindsay, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about that.
Sure. So I want to be really clear that what certainly I'm not saying is that, and I realise that Paul and I maybe don't completely agree on everything. I think that there are some things that are important in this space. I do think transparency and rigour are really important. If we ever want markets to be able to really pay serious attention, we're going to need data that they have confidence in. And I think that aspect is really important. But I also think it's really important not to get lost in the data and think somehow if only we get perfect data, everything will make sense. I think we need to see business decisions that are, well, it's already clear directionally where we're headed. Holding out for perfect data is part of the problem, but I do want to acknowledge that transparency and data do matter. But a lot of the concerns that we see and the debate about, has ESG and voluntary action all been helpful or part of the problem? And we intentionally did a kind of mea culpa. We acknowledge that we've probably spent as an institute in the past maybe too much time looking at individual business transformation and not enough on sector-wide, market-wide transformation, because we believed, as Paul said, that leaders would step out and others would follow, and that hasn't happened. But I think there's a vast amount of time and talent being spent in reporting, but we're not going to disclose our way through an industrial revolution. And as one board director I was speaking to last week said, look, we're spending so much time weighing the goose, but it's not getting fatter just because we weigh it more. We need to be spending time and energy on the doing and the innovating, and recognize there's more data on the balance of time on reporting versus innovating and value creating. Has it been a barrier or problem? I think we've heard from within government that when they saw this wave of pledges and commitments from business, they were somewhat impressed, taken aback, and said, well, maybe we don't need to legislate, and the private sector is so across this. Actually, it's happening, and there's not a lot needed. We've set the big ambition, and the market's now stepping in. And there was that gap between, I think you called it the Pledge Fest, Alice, which I love the term. We had this Pledge Fest, and then not enough. Rolling up sleeves, doing the work on the transition. And so we're having to go back to saying, actually, we do need governments to step in. After we published the first report, I actually got a surprising number of partners from consultancy firms contacting me and saying, you know what, my work has been part of the problem. We have overcomplicated it because that's kind of our business model. So an acknowledgement that some of the work in that space has been, bringing rigor, but arguably has in some ways overcomplicated and put a huge amount of time and expense into something which has clouded the windscreen in some ways and got in the way of more rapid action. I do think there is some space for voluntary action still. I mean, some of the activity we do at CISL is in that space, but I think back to Paul's challenge around this, this has to be real business, has to be really clear on exactly what problem it's solving, that it has a credible strategy to solve it. It has access to key decision makers, so it's not kind of nice conversations in the corner, but no real routes to power and influence. And very specifically time-bound or with review periods, like really, are we moving the dial or are we wasting energy? So there's opportunities to really take stock. So I'm not in the space of no voluntary action is needed. Some of that can be valuable, but it has to be really focused and effective.
Okay, thank you. So I think now's the pivot point to which we start looking to much more to the future and what's actually required to get us to the state that we're describing in this report. And so the third point is around preparing for transformation and competition. So the question I have for you, we'll start with you, Lindsay, and then over to Paul. Very dear to my heart because it sort of relates to education. So what capabilities should companies build now to prepare for competition and to avoid ultimately, as you described, being left behind?
Sure. So I would split this out. I would say this isn't just capability. It's really important. I'll come to that. I think it's culture. I think overcoming decades of perception that this is soft and nice to have, or being fatalistic, a sense, what can we do? We're just businesses. We stay in our lane. We've got no agency. I think cutting through that to really create a sense of agency, and that this is a commercial value creation imperative. I've suddenly gone into the dark here, probably sitting still too long in a whatever motion activated light room. I think decision support tools are also critical. I see a lot of challenges when they're just not effective tools to support or a reference point for decision making. I think scenarios around plausible futures aren't there. So I was in a food company board recently who were very clear that they were pessimistic that we'll see global action to address climate change. But they had no strategy and no scenario against which to test their strategy that's saying, well, how will you still do business as a food company in argue potentially a 3-degree world? So tools to test business strategy against a range of plausible futures, rather than just relying on today's, I suppose, vibe or market sentiment as the test case, as the reference point. I think accurate analysis of not just the direct costs and the direct opportunities, but the costs of inaction or the indirect benefits of action. If you're a greener, smarter company, will that mean that you're a preferred supplier to others, and will you be able to get a greater portion of market share there? Analysis about where the tipping points lie. The economics might not yet be favourable, but where are we close enough to the edge that by leaning in and working and innovating, you could help tilt those economics? And then sources of data. More important, as I said, to be directionally correct, but there are a whole range of, I suppose, unusual non-standard sources of data. I know some investment companies work with our colleagues in Cambridge around nature and biodiversity to get access to data there. But you asked me about capabilities. And I think this is really important. In some ways, it's an application of existing capabilities. To Paul's point, businesses know, they do strategy, they know how to, that's what they do, think commercially. So some of that is just application of those capabilities to this issue. And obviously some of what we do is just helping to really immerse people who know how to run businesses and respond strategically, commercially into this context, because often it's been arm's length or seen as a different team's issue. But I also think there are important capabilities that are around how to influence change, how to influence government, how to activate trade bodies. So I've sat in rooms with, say, built environment companies who are seeing lack of market barriers, there are not joined up transition plans. And they're saying, well, we'll just have to sit and wait till it emerges. And when we push and say, well, why would you not be proactive in nudging that forward? Then they said, well, I don't know, we've got capabilities or people working in those areas. Maybe we need to strengthen teams there. So I think understanding and building the capability to be able to do the market building and making, which might be across value chains, it might be working directly with the public sector. So I think those culture, decision support tools and capabilities are really important.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd briefly add, Paul, before we bounce on to the fourth leadership priority?
There is. I think if go back to my points earlier about the cultural shift we need to make. As Lindsay just said, business knows how to do strategy, right? And what they don't know and don't understand well is how sustainability is going to impact on their business, on the economy, on the market going forward. And that's one of the key things I think, programs like CISL, etc., is that business now needs to learn not what the cool kids are doing on sustainability, as in reporting, as in measuring this and having targets for X, Y, Z, but what sustainability means, right? So it means, for example, climate impacts, it means food crises, perhaps it means insurance costs going up, it means, all those things mean that how does that affect my strategy as a company? So there is a need for a much stronger, I think, understanding from business leaders and from sustainability and strategy people inside companies. How is sustainability going to translate in the economy? Not in some theoretical 20, 30 years time, but what does it mean now if we have more extreme weather? What are the risks, for example, of insurance industry having a financial crisis as a result of X, Y, Z? What does it mean if we rapidly accelerate the energy transition in a disruptive way towards more consumer-led energy generation, et cetera, et cetera? So knowing that means they can then, to Lindsay's point, develop their strategy. But they have to have enough knowledge around sustainability, not what the company's doing in the sustainability space, but what does sustainability mean for my company? That's I think, a really important knowledge shift that has to happen once you have the culture shift.
Okay, so I'm seeing that people are straining in the questions to interject and ask questions already. So we'll whiz through the final few points now. And the next one's around innovation to create and protect value. So there's a huge amount of innovation underway already. So what more or different are you suggesting as part of this leadership priority, Paul?
Yeah, I think there's a really good example, what I'm very focused on at the moment in the food area, food and agriculture, and just did a new report CISL published called Renewable Food in this area, is that there is a really very consistent evidence of failure from incumbent industries to recognise disruption is coming. So the innovation is seen to be on the edges of our space, just in case we need it at some point in the future. And if you look at the IEA various forecasts, a sort of famous set of charts around this about the IEA's inability to forecast the growth of renewables, and consistently do so over years and years and years of underestimating the pace of growth, is that the default position for an incumbent industry has got to be, we're going to get this wrong and we're going to underestimate it. Whereas at the moment, the default position is change will be slow. We should do something in the area, but not too much. We should have a venture fund over here and keep our eye on this space, as opposed to seeing it as a disruptive threat. And that, to me, is the innovation intensity. So it's not that companies can't do innovation, It's that they don't do it at the right level of intensity as though it's a really serious disruptive business threat. Because what's happening now, especially in post AI technology, biotech, etc., we are going to see all these innovations accelerate rapidly in the market. So you put that together and you say, okay, well, if we're an incumbent industry, right, we are going to be disrupted by new approaches in various ways. Are we going to wait, to Lindsay's point, until that happens and then scramble to respond, which is what we saw with electric vehicles, for example, massively expensive to try and catch up afterwards, causing huge loss of value inside the auto industry today, as opposed to innovating to begin with and really being on top of that process of innovation and change. And the same thing I think is about to happen in food, where we are going to see really substantial shifts in the way we produce food to address the climate impacts on the food system, but also to address the food industry's impact on climate change. So I think it's all about intensity and taking it seriously as a disruptive threat to the industry and to your industry, and recognizing you have to invest a lot more than you are today in that process. And there are many, many partners who want to do that, but it needs a strategic decision by the company to recognize that innovation has to ramp up very significantly as we now move into the era of impacts of our lack of sustainability today.
Thanks, Paul. Lindsay, I know CISL, we work a lot with innovation, so if you wouldn't mind just briefly building on that before we move on. We've got about 5 minutes left of the conversation before we come to Q&A.
Okay, so yes, it's absolutely core to what we do increasingly. This has really risen up the agenda. We within our building in Cambridge, our home in Cambridge, we have a whole startup community now. But and of course, in a resource carbon constrained world, there's going to be huge demand for a whole range of new technical solutions. But the challenge isn't just one of new technologies, it's the scaling challenge, and that's a big piece of the picture, particularly in the UK and Europe. So a lot of our work is in that space as well. Spaces around where there's a need for collective innovation, where sectors have shared dependence on, say, common infrastructure or particular technologies. So work we're doing in aviation is clearly relevant there. It's hard to have a patchwork of solutions. We need a joined up global solution there. Where there's scope to really build and tilt market demand to make action aspirational, and a whole range of opportunities there. And Cambridge has some great work also in behavioural economics, which is relevant to that. And then a focus on where we can trigger tipping points, where sectors or regions are most exposed, and food is obviously one, where the economics are on the verge of tipping, where there are clusters of innovation. So taking a systems frame on what are the, where you need renewables and storage and grid to all can be working together for that whole ecosystem to be able to work. So a range of areas of work we're doing there in the innovation space, working with groups of organizations, but also with individual companies. L'Oreal is a big iconic one where we're working with them on innovation in their supply chain, for instance. But this will be increasingly core to our institutional work.
Thank you. So we're going to move into the changing the rules of the game area, which is such a big focus in the report on policy action, and the questions I'm seeing coming through relate to this. So I'd love to get to those, but there's a couple of major challenges at the moment. So how do you get corporate support for this when many businesses are frustrated at what they see as over-regulation, the cost that comes with over-regulation? And then the second thing is whether or not it's realistic that we will get political action with so many geopolitical challenges dominating agendas and net zero becoming so politically toxic. So how do we move within that to change the rules of the game? Lindsay, can I come back to you with that one, please?
Sure. And I think we recognise that there are many, as I said, broadly in the sustainable business space, that increasingly recognise the need for policy action. But this is not about more regulation or more bureaucracy or more disclosure, but about effective regulation. It's about creating the incentives, creating a level playing field, helping to build that bridge, those transition plans, so that businesses can confidently invest, innovate for the future. would also say it's not just about high-level pledges. We've had that era. It also is about the practical transition planning. So kind of rolling up sleeves, doing things in the right order, really effective public-private collaboration on that. There are examples, I think, from Denmark. There's been some effective collaboration there in sectors, including construction, on just the green shift. It's just a kind of an economy-wide thing, which has joined up working and thinking. It's also being clear about what interventions work. There is not a single silver bullet kind of policy or intervention that will make this work. A whole range of different interventions, depending on what we're trying to do, is drive innovation or scale or incentivize transition or phase out. There's some high-level examples of the report there. There's increasing evidence from what's worked globally into what are the best interventions at different points of that kind of innovation and deployment cycle. It doesn't need all to be at national levels. For instance, Fortescue, who are focused on green shipping fuels, were very focused on the International Maritime Organization. So very targeted on sector level regulators rather than just national. So that just because you don't have national political engagement doesn't mean you can't get industry breakthroughs. But of course, there's a need to recognize current political landscape and have smart tactics that are relevant to that. I mean, the good news is that taking action is good for business and economies and societies. So this isn't spin. It is more effectively landing those messages about in ways that align with political imperatives, which are the need for progress and growth and competitiveness and increasingly resilience and security. But a recognition that just saying, well, there are lots of geopolitical risks, so we can't make action on climate or nature or inequality priorities. Let's wait until things have calmed down is deeply naive. These issues are the drivers of many of those geopolitical risks. It's not going to get better until we take action to address them. So I think it's naive to say we can't take action. Competition for finite resources or environmentally driven migration are just going to ramp up geopolitical risk. So we can't sit it out. I also hear that. We're just going to sit this out for 3 years and see how we go. That's, I think, naive. We need to make it relevant and engage now. But it's also a battle for influence. It's not a level playing field. There are people working really hard to block progress. And I know, Paul, this is where you've spent a lot of your time and thinking.
Yeah, so I'm going to come to Paul, but I'll ask the question in the form of moving us on to the final point around building momentum for change. So I think winning the public debate and the smart tactics around that is something, Paul, you've got experience in, so we can come to you on that. But just to pose the final question is, we're hearing lots of businesses saying that the most rational thing for them to do is keep their head down, quietly get on with taking action. Silence is the strategy. Why are we suggesting that isn't the best strategy? But Paul, we'll come to you first of all on that final point as well.
Look, I can kind of answer them both together, really, which is that it goes back to the original opening of mindset shift. That if your mindset is responsibility, good for society, good for the whole economy, then regulation is seen as a policy is seen as against business, what business would otherwise do. And what we're arguing is that business is threatened by sustainability or threatened by the lack of it. It's threatened by the disruption. It's threatened by a whole bunch of changes happening in the physical, ecological and social system. And therefore policy is no longer about restricting what we do. It's enabling us to do what we do, right? So the argument for policy now is no longer about imposing extra constraints on business. It's enabling business to be successful into the future. And I think once you have that mindset shift, then advocating for policy becomes much easier because you're advocating for policy based on the collective good as well as your economic good. So let me pick an example like plastics, for example. Plastics, there was a big backlash against plastics, a few years ago, for the documentary that came out that really generated a lot of public interest in it. And so the response of companies in that area was to then have policies in place to decrease their plastic use, to increase recyclability, et cetera, at the company level. It wasn't to go and argue for policy and regulation to actually make that happen at the system level. So the result, of course, was that companies did improve their performance, did have some impact on creating a more recyclable set of plastic packaging, et cetera. That had no impact of any consequence or material level on the global plastic situation because it wasn't enough, it wasn't big enough. If they had, for example, engaged the public and said, yep, you're right, we need to change profoundly our approach in this area, we're going to now support policy on deposit return systems, on EPR taxes, on virgin material taxes and so on, that would have benefited those companies because they would have then got a return from addressing the issue. Whereas what was happening in their response was increasing their cost, right, by imposing extra cost on a new technology and being used in the companies, but not actually generating a significant change in the material impact of plastic in society. So that once you make the mindset shift that we're arguing for policy because it's good for our business, right, and not some obscure 20, 30-year away question, but right now, then the enabling happens. How do I then get support for that? Who do I have partnerships with? I don't have partners with companies that actually aren't really on board with the change. I need partnerships with NGOs. I need partnerships with think tanks. I need partners with academic institutions that can help me articulate this case. And that is the key to me to engaging more broadly, is to recognise that we need to have policy as a fundamental driver of the transformation, and that policy is now in the interests of some companies, and those companies need to advocate for it.
Excellent, Paul. Thank you. I'm going to come to you, Lindsay, for a couple of minutes on building momentum for change and wrap up while you buy me time to consolidate some of the questions coming through. So over to you, and then we'll get to the questions. So please do post these in the chat.
Sure. And I'm acknowledging that we haven't talked about some of the what lies behind some of the why is this even why is there backlash, and the politics and some of the I suppose well-funded campaigns that are intending on delaying momentum, but happy to come to that if there are questions on that. But back to the building momentum, I hear a lot of, we're just going to keep our head down, we're going to stay in our lane, we're quietly getting what we're doing. And my pushback is I can completely understand it, because there have been a lot of direct attacks. There are risks, and I'm not claiming they don't exist. But if everyone's tucked away, quietly doing their thing, there is no sense in the market that there's real momentum. That is somewhat masked. We also won't get the political action we need if politicians don't think this is a vote-winning strategy, if they think citizens don't care. And at the moment, there's increasingly kind of strong narratives in a range of economies that citizens don't want action and see it as woke or naive, in spite of all the surveys that we see where the data shows citizens do care. I think a really important role for the private sector as visibly being part of momentum building and dispelling some of those myths and misinformation and strategic disinformation. I think very explicitly speaking up to demonstrate that taking action is good for society, highlighting the benefits for society, and proving it's possible. So back to Fortescue, when they were focused on the International Maritime Organization, because a lot of the challenge was, this is pie in the sky, it's not technically possible. They took a dual fueled boat and put it right under the noses of the decision makers to demonstrate this isn't a theoretical possibility, it's possible. So using proof points or hero projects to really build confidence that this is doable. Then we also need a level of honesty about the choices ahead. I think there's been too much we have quite polarized debates from those that are really resisting change and those that are very actively pushing for change, but we've got a missing middle, and we've allowed it to be a fight between taking action or not taking action, but we don't have the option to not take action, but there are political choices about what that action should take. And I think greater honesty that recognizes there are choices and there will be costs, and that needs to be a good, well-informed debate. We need a credible vision that's relatable. Too much of the what will a sustainable future look like is based in kind of rural idylls that doesn't reflect most people's realities. What would a sustainable future look like for the billions of people that live in cities? What's a sustainable urban future look like that is relatable and does speak to individual aspirations? And I think we also need to look at the messengers. We shouldn't be leaving it only to school children or activists to be speaking up for what's actually good for business and good for markets. We have a missing middle. Who are the people who are credible communicators of the fact that we need to take action? So looking not only at more compelling messages and proof points, but also think about who really does have a credible voice in this space.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. I am tasked with the unenviable challenge of trying to synthesize down over 40 questions. I don't think we will get to many of those before the end of this conversation, of course. And I am going to just pick them at random, to be honest. So I do believe that, Lindsay, you have a wrap-up slide as well. So we'll do some Q&A before coming to the wrap-up slide. And there's quite a couple of questions coming through around measurements. So having moved away from saying how important transparency is, but we can't kind of disclose our way out of a crisis. But when we do measure transformation, quality, not just transformation speed, how would you suggest we go about that in corporate change initiatives? So quite kind of a practical implementation question there.
Do you want to take that one, Paul?
Sure. Look, I think the key goes back to the focus on value creation for companies. That the measurement, for example, of plastics, the example I used before, has got to be the recycling across levels across the system, for example, as opposed to what your particular company is doing. So I think that I'm not saying, as Lindsay said, voluntary action still matters, but it matters in order to have the credibility to argue for the system change. So people in companies get obsessed by measuring their own performance and their own targets, which is not irrelevant, but it's not material to their actual task at hand. So it's a necessary precondition to then argue for what we're measuring more broadly. So, for example, on plastics, what we need to understand is what is the level of virgin plastic use, what is the level of recycling and recovery across an economy, as opposed to by my individual company. And so it's again, just don't overdo that measurement. The measurement really is about the business. And this is hard. I don't want to pretend our job is to simplify the messages to communicate. It's hard to work out how to change a society, how to change a system. And it's hard to work out where the value is in that for your company. But that's the task at hand. How do you measure it in a way which is relevant to your business, which is not subject to the whims and preferences as sentiment changes, but is integrated into the actual business strategy of the company and is therefore measured accordingly.
Yeah, and I think there's a cluster of questions around market sentiment and the big focus on attention, just in terms of both the buzz that was around ESG is now around AI technology. Obviously, hugely resource intensive. There's lots of versions and variations to the AI question. So I'll just ask kind of a version of it. Is this a solution or a driver of systemic instability if we look at just AI as a vast subject to go alongside sustainability? Either one of you are very welcome to jump in and answer that. Paul, you are drawing a large breath.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the answer is yes, it is absolutely part of the solution and absolutely part of the systemic problem. And that's the choice that we make. It's like a question, are markets good or bad for sustainability? Yes, and yes. So AI could be an astronomically beneficial solution to creating food more efficiently, to driving down emissions, to analysing agriculture, to integrating energy systems and to use our grid more effectively. Very exciting. It could be a huge draw of power from the grid, but also a huge congregation and aggregation of power to certain tech companies, which undermines democracy and so on. So it is all those things. And I think the critical question for us as sustainability people is how do we not fall into the trap of oversimplifying that and saying AI is bad or AI is good. AI needs to be managed, with good policy and with good company strategies and leverage for its benefit. And that requires us to engage with it, not with an ideological view, but with a opportunity view. Markets, there's plenty of good arguments as to why capitalism and markets are the main cause of the problem in sustainability, right? But there's also plenty of good arguments as to why capitalism and markets are a critical driver of the solution in sustainability. But you have to engage in that, not take a simplistic view, I would say.
Yeah, anything to add to that, Lindsay?
I thought that was a brilliant response. Agree with that. Where we're increasingly needing to engage as an institute is to be able to find ways to embrace and engage with that complexity, not only say, look, it's so big, we're just going to focus on the positive use cases, and not only say, this is, massively destructive and deeply problematic. And the challenge is how to engage in such a fast-moving but also politicized sphere. It is, it's related to, in some ways, geoeconomics and global power battles. So, being able to engage effectively where we recognize that it's how it's deployed and the choices that are made, and to do that without feeling that you're somehow being, positioned as a technophobe or because you're raising legitimate questions. There are real questions of power and control and ownership and governance, and have to engage with those that really are open to the huge potential and the potential for, democratizing, giving access to decision making, being more inclusive. So being open to all of that whilst not being naive about the bigger challenges. And that's not easy. And where we've got longer programs, we can give much more space to that. The challenge is how we engage and really contribute, when we have very finite time, and these are such huge challenges. So I'm just acknowledging the challenge of this huge evolving industrial revolution that's going on alongside the one that we are trying to, I suppose, force and accelerate.
Yeah, absolutely. There's quite a few questions coming in related to finance and the management of risk and capital allocation, etc. The one that I'm drawn to is around the fact that insurers have been flagging environmental risks for years and haven't really seen that push required from industry. So, for example, to your points earlier on food, Paul, so how do you kind of use that risk to motivate industrial change in agriculture, food production, etc.? So does that imply that business either doesn't or can't do strategy in the face of short-term pursuit of profit?
I'll jump in. Look, I think it goes back to a point Lindsay made earlier about capability. Is that the insurance industry, for example, is definitely suffering or will suffer more as a result of the unpredictability of climate risks. But their solution is to analyse it as actuaries and adjust their premiums to make sure they don't lose financially in that process, as opposed to trying to take the position, okay, well, we need to do that, but we also need to advocate more broadly to policymakers and society about the broader systemic risk involved. And that's a capability issue as much as it's a mindset issue. And I think that applies to the finance sector generally. Is the finance sector, a bit like AI, can be a huge beneficiary to the sustainability cause, or it can be an impediment. And it's not about them taking on board sustainability as a philosophical question. It's about them learning to advocate to address these systemic economic risks that we face, and learning how to do that more effectively. And as Lindsay also said, being a public advocate for that, as opposed to going away and hiding and quietly talking to people. How do you engage in that more broadly? I think is the missing link, if you like, in that process.
Sure, thank you.
I would just add that some of the uninsurability of assets and kind of the potential looming climate-induced credit crunch is a really compelling framing that I find does get corporate attention. That has been a wake-up call, and the blog from one of the board members at Allianz was really powerful. We've got vast stacks of evidence around GDP impacts of inaction, but somebody on the board of an insurance company telling the story, which is entirely clear and believable, and we've got the evidence around that about where we're headed if we don't take action, is really powerful. But where we're focused in this space, and we work with a range of insurers, is not just the flagging that insurance will have to withdraw, but how careful can insurers be an enabler of transition? How can they be part of that conversation and enable and provide the financial support around credible transition plan? So I think there's an important piece there, from just risk management to support for transition. But there are a whole range of other areas of focus in finance broadly that will be really important unlocks. Of course, finance can only finance what's happening in the real economy, but need to be engaged and at the table. And some of those decision support tools, or the measurements we're talking about, need to speak to real financial value. So there are some pieces there at that kind of interface, and a need to for that kind of investor company interface to be working much more effectively than it is, than companies chucking out data that investors really are not, or whatever, are not paying attention to and are not themselves using in their own valuation and assessment. There are new financial kind of products needed that will provide some unlock. And there are places where there's been, we know a lot of talk for a long time about blended finance, but there are some unlocks there. There are places where different sources of finance can play different roles that actually then will lead to ultimately mainstream financial markets being harnessed. So way too much to cover there. We have recently published a report, Rewiring Finance, that speaks to some of that. And I've done a lot of work around the insurance and investment and that risk space as well, about that interface between financial institutions and real economy.
This is the point at which my palpitations start rising, because we've got a few minutes left. We're going to close on the hour, and the volume of high quality questions is quite reflective of the audience, I guess, that this webinar is targeted at. I feel like there's going to be a new paper, so you both probably need to clear the decks for the coming months, because we can probably respond to a lot of these and shape it into a third paper. But I'm going to ask us to kind of wrap up on a bit of an inflection point that came through in a cluster of questions in terms of who is actually leading the way.
Paul, do you want to comment?
Yeah, no one anywhere near well enough, because the people who are leading the way in terms of doing stuff in the economy and delivering the change are so busy delivering and funding up their companies and growing their businesses that they're not very good advocates for the systemic change that we need. So you don't really see, I mean, we're starting to see it in energy and renewables, but by and large, it's not a very strong push in favour of the transition, whereas there's still a very strong push against the transition from those who resist change. And so I think that the missing piece in that is that and which is the essence of these two papers that Lindsay and I wrote, is that we're not seeing the progressive businesses that are now the incumbents in various industries learning how to advocate more strongly for the change that we need to have across the board. And that sort of brings together all the arguments, the mindset shift, the beyond ESG, the need for innovation, etc. Is we're not seeing that come through strongly enough. And it's not because stuff isn't happening. It's just that it's happening from people who are radical disruptors in the energy space, in the food space, in the transport space, and so on, who are busy running their businesses as opposed to having to advocate for it. So it's that critical mass of advocacy, I think, is still what's missing, and government still suffers from this idea that, you know, regulation and policy on sustainability, climate, inequality, whatever, is imposing constraint on business and is opposed by business. And that's no longer true, but they're not feeling that from the business community, and that's what I think is the big missing piece.
Who's leading? Agree with Paul on the leading in speaking up to push for system change, particularly in the transition space. But I think who's leading in, I suppose, disrupting markets and just innovating? China, very significantly, huge innovation, not just on climate, but on resource productivity, on nature. Been really quite impressed by the work that they've done on accounting and market-based mechanisms around that. So seeing some real thoughtful long-term approaches, and of course challenging if you're sitting in a Western headquartered multinational to say, but you know, we can't do that because we don't have the context. But European businesses will still be outcompeted by those that are benefiting from that investment, government commitment, subsidy in China. So seeing real leadership there, seeing leadership from, I suppose there are some, in some cases, privately owned or billionaire-backed entities that are absolutely able to bet on the future, and again, have the luxury of being able to do so, but it will disrupt. So I think paying attention only to peers who are trapped in the same context isn't the right place to be looking at where's the disruption coming from, and where will that lead to tipping points in markets, and prepare to fast follow, recognize there'll be disruption. And there's a huge amount of great innovation. It's the scaling issue, and a lot of attention on that, but will, as Paul said, need more kind of leaning in, speaking up to address those barriers to scaling, rather than just having lots of micro initiatives or hero projects that, you know, all could be scaled but are not being scaled. I'll stop there in the interest of time, because I know we've got 2 minutes.
1 minute
Let me
and 20.
jump in 30 seconds to reinforce the China message, but to recognise that they've already won on EVs, solar and batteries, right? And it's going to be very hard for the West to catch up. But it's the same thing is now happening in food. And we're kind of focused on China for good reason, but it's really Asia. So in the case of food and the new technologies coming through in food, the focused investment, the number of patents, the innovation in this area is dominantly coming from a government point of view out of Asia. So it's China, but it's also Singapore, it's South Korea, etc. So there's a really important idea there that it's the emerging economies that actually are likely to win in this area, and that not just the US going backwards, but even the European context going backwards at risk of being overtaken in that area. And we've seen it happen in transport energy batteries. We are now going to see it happen in food unless we more broadly globally try and unify around that new approach.
Wonderful final last words there from Paul. Thank you also very much indeed for joining us. Cruel to only give us 1 hour as part of this conversation, but really appreciate the challenge, testing our thinking, and it's just been such a joy to see all the questions which we'll endeavour to answer. So thank you all so much for joining.
Thanks, Alice.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.